You probably remember that functions can be odd, they can be even, or they can be neither. And you've come across this when you looked at regular polynomial functions. The same is true of trigonometric functions. And if we look at the cosine and the sine functions, we can, just by looking at them, determine whether these are odd or even. Remember, even functions are symmetric with respect to the y-axis. So if you fold them over the y-axis, they should be the same on either side. And if you look at the cosine, so here's cosine. If you folded this across the y-axis, it would be exactly the same. So cosine is even. If you look at sine, it's not the case, so it's definitely not even. The definition of an odd function is that they're symmetric with respect to the origin. So imagine spinning this around the origin 180 degrees. If you did that 180 degrees, you would get the same thing. So this is symmetric with respect to the origin. So the sine of theta is odd. The other thing to know, and you can see this in its graph too, but I don't have the graph here of the secant, is that the secant, which is 1 over the cosine, that is also even. The rest of these are odd. So if you see secant or cosine, you know it's an even function. If you see some other trig function, it's going to be odd. So let's take a look at this problem now. It says for each function below, indicate whether it's odd, even, or neither. We have the cosine and the secant, so both of these are going to be even functions. If you couldn't remember this, you weren't sure, you could plug the secant of x into the graphing calculator and take a look at it and see if it's symmetric about the y-axis. And then we've got a couple of problems here. They want the value for the cosine of negative 67 degrees, or the secant of negative 3 pi over 10. And they're not asking for some specific, square root of 3 over 2 or whatever. What they're pointing out is that even functions have this property, that f of negative x equals f of x. So in this case, the cosine of negative 67 degrees equals the cosine of 67 degrees. So we can write it that way. The secant of negative 3 pi over 10 is going to equal the secant of a positive 3 pi over 10. When you have an odd function, you get this other relationship that negative f of x equals f of negative x. So let's say you had this sine, or you had negative sine of pi. That equals the same thing as the sine of negative pi. So that's a little bit of work with the odd and the even trig functions.